This is what I'm going to do. I'll reduce the charge, and we'll have a summary trial. But you've got to plead to it. It'll be months before you go out for sentence, and you'll be out on bail. You'll be able to do a bit of villainy and provide for your family when you do go away.
There was alarm and consternation by the establishment. There was panic about the possibility that the institution of law and order was in such a parlous state.
As far as anyone out there is concerned, you don't exist anymore. Not until I say so.
The idea was to get behind the public relations, to get behind what the public comfortingly wanted to believe, and find out what it was really like.
The thing is, there's £1,000 in it if you want to help.
What sort of derby, Andy?
Those with actual working knowledge of the law were uplifted to see a side of the law which certainly existed being put on television.
What is your verdict?
Guilty.
Leave off! It's all bollocks, it's got to be! Well, you deaf, dumb and blind at 12, what's the matter with you?
The programme blew me away. I remember coming down and watching it and was hooked within minutes to this very dramatic, radical, refreshing way of looking at these important legal themes.
Police, don't move! What the Christ? Police, don't move, you're nicked! What's the matter with you? What's going on? Don't move.
Jack, what's it then?
My interest, most of my life, has been in a sort of distilled social realism. I'm just curious, really, about the world, and I wanted to go out with all my colleagues and make some sense of it and find out what was really happening, which is usually different from what the press tell you or certainly institutions tell you. So I was always looking for subjects that would satisfy my curiosity.
There were two defining moments in my life regarding that brought me to law and order. One, at the age of 6 in 1953, I was on a lane in Kent with a shirt full of pears that I'd been given by a man in his garden. And as I got to the bottom of this lane, there's an orchard, and being a 6-year-old, I stopped outside the orchard and tried the gate. And as I was doing this, a police car swept down the lane. The policeman got out and said, "What have you got in your shirt?" Being a 6-year-old, I said, "Nothing." And he called me an unrepeatable liar and smacked me round the ear, took all my pears, got back in the car, drove off. In 1968, I was living in Mayfair, and the anti-Vietnam march came out of Berkeley Square into Mount Street and round into Grosvenor Square. And there were hundreds of police and dozens of mounted police. And the police were charging into the crowd as they tried to surge forward to the embassy. But also in the crowd, you had people stabbing at the horses. And I realised then there was no right and there was no wrong on either side, that neither side had the moral high ground.
You can't understand how this show got to be made without understanding that the BBC then was a very different animal from the BBC now.
It was a means of a voice which has largely disappeared from television because of the pressure of numbers and audiences.
I remember the days, you know, when people would stop in, not go out, because there was what they called a play, which was usually a film, which was made for television on TV that night. So Wednesdays for a long time became, you know, the night when you stayed in for the Wednesday play. And I think people had been drawn into it. They were gradually educated into knowing that this stuff was worth watching.
My experience as a viewer of single plays in the 60s and 70s was that they were certainly a voice for comment, a voice for observation.
In those days, they believed in producer power. The idea was that producers should have autonomy, complete freedom to do what they wanted to do. If they thought there would be a problem, it was their job to refer upwards in the BBC's phrase. So because the supervision was, as a matter of policy, less intrusive, it was possible to get a show like this shot.
All senior officers will draw a firearm. But remember, there's no guarantee that any of these four were involved. But they're all at it, of course. So get hold of them like you mean it.
In 1969, I wrote the book and published it. It was called Sir, You Bastard. And it was about endemic corruption in the police force.
His paperback novels seemed just to have the ring of truth about them. I thought he hasn't made these people up. He knows some of these people.
I got to know a couple of lads who went into the police force, and I stayed in touch with them, and they talked quite openly about things that went on in the police force. And I decided to write about it. And it caused quite a stir in 1970 because by then we were accepting that there was the odd bad apple in the barrel, but no one was accepting that the barrel was entirely corrupt and totally susceptible to corruption. And the book argued that there was very little difference between the police and the criminals.
Right up until Law and Order and afterwards, and certainly going way back through into the last century, if you were professional middle class and above, you had enormous respect for the police because they were defending you against criminals. And they were very unlikely to offend you in any way. If, however, you were a member of the working class, particularly if you were unemployed, you had a different attitude towards the police.
Coming from the East End, there's always been a cynical view about police. I mean, forget about Dixon, and we always thought he was crooked. At Christmas he must have had a turkey off the local farmer for nothing, but nobody would believe that. It was always good evening all. So you think police corrupt from a young age in the East End?
One of the big changes that happened, of course, was the motor car. Because as more and more people started to drive, and as more and more laws came in, necessarily to deal with the problems arising from the roads not being good enough for the number of cars, more and more, as it were, respectable citizens had to face the police. They broke the law. So the attitude to the police, I think around the time that Law and Order was happening, was on a cusp.
The book Sir, You Bastard caused quite a stir, and that was how I came to meet up with Tony Garnett. He called me up and said, would I like to write a piece about corruption in the police force?
So I took him for a walk around Hyde Park, and after about 2 hours, we'd worked the framework up.
The story was just told from the police perspective, and you got a glimpse of criminals, but you didn't actually get involved or see the criminals. And he said, when I delivered the script, he said, well, it doesn't end. And I said, well, no, it doesn't end. Well, these stories don't end, they're ongoing. So he said, well, why don't we do another one? And he commissioned another script, and I then told the story from the perspective of the criminals. And again, having delivered this, it still didn't end. So he commissioned yet another script to show what happened to the criminals, how they were taken through the courts. And because there was so much material in that last script, we decided to split it and make 2 scripts, and it became a quartet.
I then had to research myself to some extent because my name was going to be on this. The thing that really struck me was that corruption in the Met at that time was not an exceptional thing. It was systematic. So how do we make the show where the audience is being told something that it does not want to hear?
The level of corruption was not something I knew about or understood until I began to meet some of the people that Gordon had been talking to.
Life is corrupt. I mean, business is corrupt, politics is corrupt. I mean, it's to do with with human nature.
Not a bad day's work, eh?
No, nice touch, Gun.
How much you looking for? I think we agreed on half, Billy.
Everyone, you might say, is at it, to use the expression from Law and Order. And how could the legal system be separate and different from anyone else in life?
My client believes that he is unlikely to receive a fair hearing before your lordship.
I had no legal background. It was legwork and research and just talking to people, finding lawyers like James Saunders, who was, probably still is, one of the leading criminal solicitors.
I was a young, thrusting criminal lawyer in the 1970s, and our paths crossed. A couple of the cases I did, I wouldn't say the series was based on them, but material was freely drawn from the cases. It's nice, I suspect, to use real material, and although it's not one case, a lot of Law and Order is actually an assembly of things that really did happen.
Policemen introduced me to so-called bent solicitors. Introduced me to criminals as well. Criminals introduced me to lawyers they used and told me stories of things that happened in the legal profession, and that's the way one did the research.
OK, start a docket. See if we can't put him away this time. Looks as though he might be due.
Overdue, I'd say.
I was faced with a dilemma. How do we produce this show in a way that will shock the audience, as indeed it ought to shock the audience, who don't really want to believe this, because it is just much more comforting to believe that these people are looking after us. I felt that the show ought to treat the corruption as a normality. It's systematic. It's so systematic we don't even comment on it. I therefore needed it to be directed with the grain of that idea, which is why I asked Les Blair.
It was a huge job. In fact, the whole business of making these films was the nearest thing I've had to a job on the line at Ford's. I think it's the nearest thing I've had to a proper job, as my dad would have put it. It was just plain hard work.
Les has a very dry, matter-of-fact, laconic style. Sort of, well, a little shrug, you know, he just does it.
He was just very quiet and knowledgeable. It's like he did know everything of how it should be.
Les is very quiet. I don't know whether he still is. He seems like very, very quiet. I put him like the dormouse in Alice. You know what I mean? You want to stuff him in a teapot and all that. But he's lovely. I love him. I love him. But he's got a way with him and he gets what he wants out of you. All directors have got their own little ways of doing it. But Les has got this quiet way. I want you to... Yeah, all right, OK, fine. And you do it.
It starts to get light about 5:45. So we'll hit the 4 addresses at 5:15. So that way there'll be less resistance.
What if one of them's got up for a leak gun?
The approach was finding people who could play as close to the reality of detectives as we could get, because a lot of their experiences were from television.
Basically, everything that's in, or had been, in TV cops and robbers drama was excluded for this.
Can anything be done on this one, Fred? It would certainly be to our mutual advantage.
Would you have in mind?
Well, I should think you'd be interested in doing some business.
The thing was, you'd got nothing to go on, in as much as you couldn't, in your mind, nick from anything you'd already seen. It was clear we were, you know, carving a new work of art here.
We cast people, many of whom were not professional actors. At that time, we had to say to each candidate that unless they were members of Equity, the Actors' Union, we could not employ them. And each one said, no problem, Gov. No, not a problem. And I don't know where they got their Equity cards from, but it wasn't a problem. So we had some actors who were really actors, although no well-known faces, and a lot of people who had never acted before, but were part of that world one way or the other.
There's that kind of crossover area, or there was at the time, the sort of Joan Littlewood territory of villainy and actors and their interest in each other. And it was in that kind of area of life that we looked, really.
We found people from snooker halls, minor villains, to play villains. And some of them went on to become actors.
Some people who, frankly, did have criminal records played detectives, and others played criminals. They were in the criminal mind, which detectives have to be.
You've got information we want, so you'll be here assisting us with our inquiries as long as it takes.
Yeah. It costs me nothing sitting here, does it?
Oh, you're right.
Stand up then! I worked with Les Blair in the August beforehand and did an improvisation play for the BBC. And like a lot of directors, when you're finished, they say, well done, thank you, Derek. I've got something in mind for you. And you say, OK, lovely. And you think, yeah, when I'm on the set, I know I'm working, like a lot of directors do. Anyway, come the January, my agent gets a phone call and says, we'd like Les Blair, Tony Garnett and G.F Newman, Gordon. Would you turn to Bulby Road at little school rehearsal rooms? So I turned up. Went on for about half hour. So Les said, all right, we'll let you know. So off I went, thank you very much. And all, you know, usual, you think, oh, I won't probably hear or whatever. And then my agent got a call a couple of weeks later. And they said, we can't make up our mind whether Derek plays a villain or a copper. That's how close the characters are, or the parts. So my agent said, which one's the hardest? So they said the copper. So he said, right, he'll do that. And that's how I got Detective Inspector Fred Pyle.
He's thinking of issuing a writ against you for malicious prosecution, Fred.
That'll be handy. Is that what you're advising him then?
No, I'm just marking your card. I went in and I think there was Tony Garnett there and Les Blair, and they were talking to me about how I'd found the script, which seemed to me quite good. And I said, can we just stop for a moment? Are you actually offering me the job of the brief? And I said, yes. And I said, listen, I have to tell you, in my mind, I'm not a solicitor at all. And they said, if we put a suit on you and a tie, got you some nice shoes, gave you a haircut, you would be very like a solicitor. I said, oh, OK.
Ken's previous work was larger, brilliant, but big, and in the theatre and so on. And he had to compress himself down into this character.
The difficulty of it was I had to really take instruction on not acting. What they wanted was it not acted. Do you see what I mean? Sometimes we had to embarrassingly retake a couple of times due to eyebrow movement or something like that, you know. And so basically I just concentrated on not acting. Yeah, like that. I mean, it's quite wonderful, isn't it? I mean, it gave it such a style, because everyone looks 1/3 to half dead in it.
We'd got a building at Euston Station, a brand new building that was by then unoccupied, which looked like New Scotland Yard, but we didn't know what it felt like inside New Scotland Yard. So through Gordon Newman, a Metropolitan detective took our designer and our director in one Saturday to have a look around. And he said, if I get stopped, I'm bringing you in for questioning. And it took them all the way around the Met, where they made little notes. Because it's just how the desks are and just the feel of something.
And a lot of it was in small rooms, was in cells or police cells. You know, I'd made certain decisions about how it was going to be shot. It was going to be shot in a naturalistic, real kind of way. There weren't going to be bizarre angles. And it's quite, in a way, the easier it looks on the screen, the harder it is to do in that sense. It would have been much easier to go in and say, right, let's shoot this from off the floor and make it look all dramatic.
Morning, Mr. Lynn. How are you feeling?
We made those decisions, and I made decisions, you know, in discussion about not using music, for example, and just letting the thing be what it was. You know, it was a real subject, a real issue, or series of issues. And so what I was trying to do was because it was about something real, I wanted it to feel real.
After the first broadcast, there was an enormous backlash against the BBC for broadcasting these films.
The first night that Detectives Tale was shown, they say the BBC were jammed for hours and hours and hours. Nobody could get through because people were just phoning up and doing their pieces saying, how dare you show a crooked copper and all that, not realising it's a drama and they were actors.
The reaction to the show initially was, not only is none of this true, but it is an outrage to suggest that any of it could be true. So there was from the Houses of Parliament through most of the press, there was a denial.
The representative of the Police Federation in Parliament, an MP called Eldon Griffiths, called for the author of the films, Gordon Newman, to be prosecuted for crimes against the state. And the Prison Officers Association and the Metropolitan Police immediately withdrew all cooperation with the BBC.
The then Director General, Ian Trathown, was summoned down to the Home Office to see the junior minister, who was a man called John Harris. And it was reported to me that he was told that Law and Order should not be repeated and should not be sold abroad. This is not the image of Britain we want presented to the world.
You keep that stuff out of me! Keep it out of me! I'm not having it in me!
One of the effects that the programme had was to expose the fact that there can be badness within the legal system, and that those errors or malpractices need to be addressed through the legal system itself.
Some momentum was building up, people asking, was this really true? And it led to changes in the law which put protection for people in custody in place.
Practice relating to police interviews, the recording of police interviews, the documentation of what goes on in police stations, the right to have a lawyer, all sorts of aspects of, and to consult a lawyer at the point of being arrested in the police station, all sorts of things that were not part of the legal system when the programme was made and broadcast, did subsequently become part of the legal system.
So, whilst it was one and only one of a number of influences, it was just at the right time, and I think it caught a public mood.
For some years after Law and Order, every time they got some tale of corruption in the law, you know, solicitors or barristers or something, they'd print my picture. A picture of me, my suit, you know, like that. So that, you know, readers would know the kind of tale this was.
I went to Chelsea on the Saturday because I'm a Chelsea fan, and I sat down in a seat like that, and I could hear spoosh, and I'm looking, thinking, well, the players ain't out yet. Geezer tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "It's you they're booing." I went, "What?" He said, "Oh, that programme." He said, "If I was you, I wouldn't go out and have a toilet at half time." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, you're liable to get a spank." He said, "There could be someone in the crowd whose son's been sent away fitted up, or a brother or an uncle or a dad." He said, "And I might see you real and go bang." I went, "No, I was busted rubber piss as well, so I didn't go." So I stood it until the end, and that's it. But they booed and hissed me at Chelsea, yeah.
I don't think they used the expression a bad apple in the barrel quite as often as they used to. Maybe that's the big difference it's made.